This is a screenshot video, crimes. We're talking about affirmative defenses, and these are some notes that go with the insanity defense. Again, because insanity is an affirmative defense, the defendant will have the burden of establishing the defense by a preponderance of the evidence. The insanity defense in New York is a variation from a test that was used years ago in England, and it's called the McNaughton insanity defense. And to prevail under this defense, the defendant has to establish two separate categories of facts. Number one, the defendant has to establish that at the time the defendant engaged in the conduct in question, the defendant was suffering from a mental disease or defect. And secondly, the defendant has to establish, because of the mental disease or defect, the defendant was not able to distinguish right from wrong, or wasn't able to understand the nature and consequences of the defendant's conduct. And it's not enough, in other words, for the defendant to establish that he or she was suffering from a mental disease or defect at the time the defendant engaged in the conduct. But also, again, because of that mental disease or defect, the defendant's cognitive abilities were so compromised that the defendant simply didn't know what he or she was doing, or wasn't able to appreciate right from wrong. And I like the two examples here. I think this first example was taken from a case in South Carolina, 20 or so years ago. But a woman has some children, and they were in her way for where she wanted to go in the future, and she decides to kill the kids. And so what she does is she drives the children into a lake by getting out of the car, putting it into gear, and watching it go into the water. The two children drown. She then files a police report saying that she had been kidnapped by a stranger at gunpoint. This was all false, of course, and the police eventually discovered the children's bodies, along with evidence indicating that the defendant had killed them. She then recants, if you will, her kidnapping story, and admits that she killed the kids. However, she claims she is not guilty by reason of insanity. And as it's pointed out quite accurately in the notes, her claim will probably not be successful because her attempt to cover up her conduct and to mislead the police demonstrated her awareness that she had done something wrong. So even if at the time she killed the two children, even if she was suffering from some kind of mental disease or defect, her conduct nevertheless indicated that she knew what she was doing was wrong, and she would have an extremely difficult time in establishing the defense of insanity. And if I recall this case correctly, she indeed wasn't able to do so. A case where there might be a good insanity defense is where the defendant had been diagnosed schizophrenic. She drowns all of her kids in the bathtub in her home. She promptly phones 911 to tell the operator that her children are dead. And she claims she's not guilty for killing the children by reason of insanity. And as they point out here, first of all, she does have a recognized mental disease or defect, and there's no evidence that would indicate she knew that her conduct was wrong. She didn't, unlike in the first story, try to cover up her conduct. And indeed, it was her who contacted law enforcement to tell them about her criminal acts. It would seem under those circumstances her conduct would be good for the insanity defense. So again, I think the key takeaway is the defendant's got to show both things. Number one, mental disease or defect at the time the crime was committed, and number two, the fact that the defendant, because of the mental disease or defect, wasn't aware of right or wrong, or couldn't appreciate the consequences of what they were doing. I think a capstone about how successful it is to establish in the insanity defense was the inability of Jeffrey Dahmer in Wisconsin. And the Wisconsin law was very much like the New York law. And everybody agreed, I believe, at trial that Dahmer, when he killed his victims, sometimes after he sexually molested them, but always before he then began to eat them, was suffering from a mental disease or defect. But the fact was he took a lot of steps to cover up what he had done, which I think is a tell in terms of his knowing that what he did was wrong, and indeed his attempted insanity defense was not successful. Let me just say a few words. I'm not going to bother putting notes up about this, but a few words about duress. Again, it's an affirmative defense, and to establish duress, the defendant's going to have to show that he committed the crime really because he had no recourse, given the fact that he or she was under threat of imminent force, physical force, unlawful physical force, or indeed physical force was being used against the defendant, or physical force was threatened against a third party. I think a good example of where duress might come into play, and I have a newspaper article that I would ask you to read, and I took it from a New Hampshire television station or newspaper, where a woman apparently a married woman was having an affair. Her husband found out, and I guess his solution was to kill the boyfriend. And it was a very abusive relationship to begin with. And he threatened her, beat her up, and made her participate in the murder, as you'll see in the newspaper article. And I think if she had gone to trial, she would have had a pretty solid defense of duress. There's a chance, of course, that it might not have been successful. And apparently the end of it all was she was allowed to plead guilty to falsification of a story to the police when she initially denied that she had anything to do with it. But I think, again, if you look at the case, if need be, I think a defendant could take her case, or defense attorney could take her case to trial and have a decent shot at the affirmative defense of duress. So we'll close this screenshot video out at this point.